Hey, good morning and welcome back to Taylor Time Live. I'm your host, Seth Gladden, and I know things look a little different today behind me, especially. We had some technical difficulties. Our air conditioning is out at our studio. So I'm joining you actually live today from my home office. So just bear with us. Things look different, but they're going to be the same. We'll have some great information for you. Today we're talking about long-term care. We're continuing our series on commercial builder multifamily, and so if you haven't checked out any of the others, feel free to do so. They're all on our YouTube channel. But today we'll be focused on long-term care, and definitely stay tuned every third Tuesday as we move forward. You aren't going to want to miss any of them as we go. I'd like to remind you, during this show, we actually have a couple of segments today, and I'll explain those in a minute. But at any point, you can text your questions in to the number on the screen. It's also in the description right there underneath the YouTube video that you're watching. So don't be afraid to text your questions in. We've got some great people on with us today, so we're excited to have that. Let me introduce our panel for long-term care really quick, and then we have something very special I want to talk to you guys about, and we'll bring him in as well. But let me start off by introducing our Director of Tech Services at Taylor, Gary Scheidker. Gary, thank you for being with us, not in studio, but remotely today.
Glad to be here, Seth. Thank you very much.
Next, we've got Robert Varden. And
hello, Seth. How you doing this morning?
Remotely. Hey, doing well. Where are you at?
I am live from Las Vegas. We actually start the TICE installation competition this afternoon. So the guys will take their written test today, and tomorrow they go hands-on for 2 days to compete head-to-head to pick the top 4 for the finals, which will take place in February. So
awesome. Well, when this is done, I'm actually going to jump on a plane and I'll see you out there in a few hours. So
great.
Thank you very much for being here, and joining us on the long-term care segment is Nick Peters with Shaw. Nick, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Nick, can you tell us just briefly what it is you do at Shaw and kind of your interaction there with long-term care?
Absolutely. So I work in the commercial division for Shaw Industries. I lead their healthcare and senior living sales strategies and initiatives. So we work globally, both in the healthcare side, which would be acute medical office and retail health, which I believe you covered in an earlier segment, and then more specifically as it relates here in all levels of the acuity spectrum commercially for the senior living applications.
Okay. So we're excited for the information you're going to bring today. Clearly you have a wealth of knowledge, and I know in talking with you yesterday just before while we were getting ready, I learned a ton of stuff there, so I'm excited to learn new stuff today and hear some of that and share that with all of our viewers. So thank you for being here. Guys, that's our program for today, is the long-term care, but before we actually discuss that, I want to introduce another special guest, and we're going to take probably 15 or 20 minutes at the beginning of our show here. As you know, our world has been a little bit crazy for the last year and a half now at this point, and we've moved through most of the COVID challenges, but now we have these supply chain challenges that are affecting all of us, not just in the flooring industry, but across the globe. So we have with us today Mark Erickson. He's our VP of supply chain with our parent company, Meridian Adhesives Group. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Seth. Yeah, no, thanks. Pleasure to be here, and glad to participate.
So, Mark, let's talk about the supply chain challenges that we've got going on now. Just kind of paint the landscape for us. Tell us a little bit about what's going on and how this all started.
Yeah, no, it's probably the best word to encompass what's happened over the last year, and which continues to happen, is a calamity. So, supply chain challenges have really just exacerbated as time has gone on, mostly because of demand. So if we If we go back to the onset of the pandemic last year, if you all recall, demand was very choppy. And if you think about the lockdowns that occurred, the leading cause of a lot of the petrochemical and refinery operating rates dropping was the loss of fuel demand. Think of flying and driving, and particularly flying. That draws an awful lot of demand from the refineries all throughout the U.S. And once that pandemic and lockdowns occurred, we saw refinery operating rates drop to about 67% in April timeframe. And typically, a normal operating rate for a refinery is in the low 90s to high 80s. And if you recall, during that time, the demand across the board was quite choppy and dropped significantly. But through this, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and then as the pandemic ensued, things were quite slow until the summertime came, and then demand started to pick up, particularly in construction. And if you think, some of the feedback that I've gotten for some of the key petrochemical suppliers and our key raw material suppliers is that they saw DIY demand during the summer pick up quite significantly. And a lot of it with folks that were home and decided to do their own DIY projects and folks that had entered the DIY market for the first time. So, one of our key suppliers is cartridges and pails, and they indicated that the amount of demand for cartridges through the summer and into the fall picked up dramatically because of the amount of small packages and adhesives and sealants and caulking type products that were being sold. But that demand through the summer, wow. If you think about the operating rates and fuel, it gradually started to pick back up. So, from the 67%, refinery operating rates, it gradually grew back to about 82% in August. And that was, August timeframe and September was really the first onset, if you all recall, where we had a cascade of hurricanes and tropical storms and named storms that entered the Gulf region. And the problem there is that, mostly for safety reasons, doesn't matter the size of the storm, but a lot of these big crackers and refineries will shut down just from a safety perspective. So, sure. As operating rates improved, they dropped back down to about 71% in September as a direct result of some of those storms. But then once September came around, the storms were the first thing that happened, but then there was an onslaught of unplanned outages at several crackers and several key raw material petrochemical producers that started to shorten the supply of a lot of key feedstocks. And on or around September is when the feedstocks, think about ethylene, think about propylene, butadiene, and benzene, link directly to a lot of the key raw materials utilized in the flooring industry. They all started to eventually creep back up. And then with the tropical storms and they shut down, it was the first depletion of inventory that occurred that kind of started this cascade of, or I'll say calamity of shortages of raw material supply.
So we had COVID started it. And then that, of course, I'm sure impacted workforce, amount of people. Then, as you said, demand was all over the board, and then it started coming back, and then we had storms come in. And then I think there was another event that you're just about to talk about that probably took us from there. So just kind of outline what happened next, and then we'll kind of catch up to where we're at today.
Yeah, and maybe just to kind of sum up, the fourth quarter of 2020 was really when we started see things change. As I say, a whole lot of unplanned outages. We saw the first sales controls and force majeures hit. And near the end of October, there was a very large liquid epoxy plant in Asia that had a fire and explosion. Kukdo, they produce about 160 kilotons of liquid epoxy, a significant portion of the global demand. that was the first event that, started, I'll say, the cascade of issues. So then LER became short. The domestic producers began to raise prices. We saw, from a construction demand perspective, polyurethanes, and particularly polyols and supply get very tight. We saw, polyol producers, isocyanate producers announce price increases, but probably the more significant event was they went on sales control, which basically limited your ability to buy those key raw materials to, what you were buying historically from an allocation perspective. So even if you had alternate suppliers qualified, in some cases, even switching to a new supplier, you were limited because they were on sales control and weren't selling to new customers. And that was the first time we started to see shipping and trucking capacity issues. On or about the fourth quarter, we started to see reliability of trucking deliveries and trucking pickups get worse. But once we turned the year, that's when things changed quite dramatically. And then in the second week of February, if you all recall, there was a polar storm, and they actually named the storm Polar Storm Uri. And that was a catastrophic event. I would probably say, it's multiple Category 5 hurricanes that caused significant impact to the entire petrochemical industry. When that polar storm hit, you think about all of these petrochemical operations, they're all outside mostly. They all require some type of water, either cooling water or steam water for heating and cooling. A lot of those pipes and valves broke. And I've seen a few pictures from some of the suppliers that shared them. And, if you recall seeing some of the winter storm pictures where a car is covered in ice, near the coast, the entire piping complex looked like that. It was pretty disastrous. But that event in and of itself, not only did it cause problems from piping and infrastructure, but it caused power issues. If you recall, Texas lost a whole lot of their power infrastructure related to the storm. And the other event, even if some of these petrochemical companies didn't shut down because of piping or water, when they shut down in very short notice because of an electrical outage, in many cases, depending on the process, a short shutdown of that nature can cause damage as well. Think of liquid epoxy. If it hardens in the pipe, then they have to actually clean out those pipes in order to get back into operation. So that event in and of itself disrupted roughly 30% of all of North American chemical production, which is significant. And it took a huge number. Yeah, and it's taken an awful long time for all of that to recover.
Yeah.
So basically what I'm hearing is between the storms, the hurricanes, the COVID, it sounds like the perfect storm. I think I saw that movie. I mean, that is crazy. And of course, I knew you were going to blame half of it on Texas, but that's okay. That's okay. We can take it.
We always blame Robert.
Let's bring Nick in here real quick as well, because I know Nick. We were discussing a little bit yesterday, and can you talk to us about how this has affected what you've seen this impact to be as well?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. I actually heard somebody make the comment the other day. We've kind of shifted, and we're headed out of a health pandemic, and unfortunately, we're walking into a supply chain pandemic because it's really hitting every industry around the globe. There was a really good article last week in Floor Covering Weekly, last Tuesday, June 8th. And it was talking exactly about this as it related to raw materials and the impacts around transportation and how that's creating cost increases, across the board. And it's going to put pressure on really every industry, and especially in the construction industry, whether it be lumber or concrete, the raw materials, as Mark mentioned, the petrochemicals. A lot of those parts and pieces go into about everything on a daily basis. So I would say from the flooring perspective, we're absolutely seeing it and feeling it. And whether it's, again, labor challenges due to due to the health pandemic, or it's things like the storm in Texas and any of the other tropical storms. And I could even relate that even to the senior long-term care when we get into that piece.
Right.
And some of the challenges just that freeze in Texas has caused for a number of those communities that now have significant insurance claims that are out there to try and fix some of those burst pipes or whatnot.
Yeah, and in the beginning, Seth, when we started these conversations months ago, it was almost like, well, some of the chemicals that we utilize in the adhesives are going to be an issue, and so we might start running short of adhesives. And back then I didn't even think of the product, and now, of course, in fact, one of our guests we had on here on last show, Terry, who does schools, he's still waiting on a product to be made, which was some rubber flooring for one of the schools, and I think. Not only did it take forever to get here, and then he had some other product that got hung up at the port, which I think also kind of relates to some of these issues we're having. But and then another large commercial contractor, I believe DDF, the same thing. It's product now too that they can't seem to get in time. And of course, especially when you're doing schools, you've got that small window to get that project, and really a lot of commercial projects end up being that way. You got kids coming in pretty soon, and you've got to have something on the floor. So
yeah, for sure. So Mark, we've got just a couple minutes left on this segment. Can you kind of bring us up to speed on where we're at today, and what do you see in the near future? Is it going to get better? Is it going to get worse? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, hard to predict, but maybe let me capture a couple more things. So. If you think about that polar storm and how long a lot of these petrochemical companies were shut down, it depleted pretty much nearly all of the inventory that was available. Think about barges and rail cars and tank trucks and the on-site tanks that a lot of these key suppliers had. Because there was a shutdown so long, it pretty much absorbed a lot of that inventory. So as they started back up, very slowly, by the way, they were hand to mouth to a lot of the customers in order to maintain supply, and that's still the case today. And that's at a backdrop when demand is increasing dramatically. So, talked about construction demand, talked about new housing, renovations. There's a lot of drive from a demand perspective across many categories that are pulling all of these raw materials, but it's not just the petrochemical raw materials, it's also production supplies. So think about pails, plastic pails, polyethylene pails, think about metal pails, think about plastic drums, plastic totes, metal drums. All of those are in very short supply. And then also don't forget pallets. Wood from a construction perspective has affected pallet supplies. So pallets are tight. Many of our customers and even us have switched to some recycled pallets just because of how tight they are. And don't forget cost. So as feedstock started to increase the last quarter of 2020, so did raw material costs. But once the polar storm hit, prices continued to escalate. We're in a cycle right now where pretty much a lot of the raw material suppliers are hand to mouth. Customers are asking for material and taking any pound that they produce. So there's very strong demand. So the second wave of pricing that we're seeing is demand driven, where a lot of these key producers are raising prices because the demand's so strong. And that's just the nature of the supply demand curve. But right now, a lot of the supply base is still hand to mouth. There's a lot of production that's very slow to return. Any type of hiccup just exacerbates the issue because they're not able to build inventory back up to the position that it should be. This time of year, it's our busy season, so trying to catch back up has been very difficult. There's multiple commodities that we have, and I know our customers have that are short in supply and are limiting our ability to ship to our customers. But the difficult question that I always get and that I always ask is, when is it going to get better? I think the backdrop
That's
of
what
demand.
I was just going to ask you.
Yeah, the backdrop of demand globally is the biggest pressure point that we have, and the inability for a lot of these key suppliers to increase their inventory is the difficult piece. I've heard some saying, near the end of the third quarter into the fourth quarter, and I've heard others say that it could be the first quarter of 2022 before things get back to quote unquote normal. But it's very hard to predict. And the other bad thing is we have to survive another hurricane season. So once we get into the August and September timeframe, if we see further disruption in the petrochemical production related to tropical storms, hurricanes, and shutdowns related to safety, then it could exacerbate the duration of issues that we see.
Right.
Hey, Mark, I got a quick
waiting
question.
For the good news.
It seemed that, pre-pandemic, I know for us and a lot of contractors and so forth that I spoke with, I mean, we were humming and buzzing pretty good prior to, pre-pandemic. Do you feel the demand now is stronger than, let's say, what it was pre-pandemic?
Yeah, I would say so. I think just from...
I mean, I know you got the supply issues, of course, but I just didn't know if, from a demand standpoint, are we that much higher than we were prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, one, we're feeling it directly. And two, if talking with our petrochemical suppliers and key raw material suppliers, many of them are sold out and they're seeing demand higher than they've ever seen before. One that sticks out pretty pronounced is polyurethane demand. So polyol demand and isocyanate demand going into the construction industry is a key piece.
Well, I kept waiting for good news. It sounds like we may still be in this. Definitely short term. Might be a little bit of a longer process. It's kind of a wait and see game. It sounds like. Mark Erickson, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a ton of good information, and we're going to do our very best at Taylor to always keep you guys informed of what we're seeing, what we're hearing in the marketplace. And we're very lucky and very proud to have a resource like Mark Erickson. So, Mark, thank you for being here.
Thanks. Pleasure being here and happy to support.
For sure.
So, do you always depress everyone, Mark?
It's like I said, this past year, and it continues to be a calamity. The number of fires. I'll say one thing before we leave. So, any of your supply chain folks and your buyers in your plants, give them some kudos. Folks like that are working the hardest that they ever have. The number of fires that come up and the number of battles to try to expedite and move up product and find out the status has never been like it is right now. So, the folks that we have that are battling these and trying to expedite materials, they're stressed. And don't forget to thank the folks that you've got at your plants because they're doing a lot of hard work.
Yeah, that's a great point. So thank your purchasing and procurement teams for sure, and supply chain. Mark, I really appreciate it. We're going to transition over into long-term care now. Obviously, supply chain affects some of that, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit. But
Sure.
Really appreciate you being here, and let's bring Gary back in at this point. And jump into long-term care. So, Nick, I want to come to you and just kind of cover a little bit, if you can paint a picture for us, not like the one behind me, but of how the market is, I guess, or the one behind you even, or Robert. We've all got paintings. So tell us a little bit about the long-term care market, what you've seen in the past 12, 18 months, shifting and changing.
And in a nice, uplifting way.
Yeah, so, I can paint that.
Positive.
I'll try to paint it for you. It won't be nearly as beautiful as the pictures behind any of us. But, honestly, to best frame it, you probably have to take a step back to the pre-COVID. And, the long-term care market was moving along and it was growing pretty briskly. 2019 had seen some of its largest growth, and they were preparing for significantly faster growth, what they call the silver tsunami, which they thought, again, is these baby boomers that are starting to age and are headed towards that 65 and older category. As of the 2020s, yeah, that's not my phrase, but so don't quote me on it, but it's out there. As of the 2020 census, I think we were at about 46 million U.S. citizens that were 65 or older, and they were gauging that in the next 2020 to 2025, they're going to add another 18, 20 million plus. That was that crest of that silver tsunami that they saw coming. And that again is across all levels of the acuity scale, from independent all the way up to skilled. But it gives you any point of reference. With 46 million as of 2020, there are actually only 3.1 million licensed long-term care beds across the U.S. So if you can imagine, that's roughly 14% or a little less than 14% of the population that potentially could need that. Not to mention the growing feeling of a lot of these 55 and older type communities that are also starting to populate around. So we fast forward a bit to the early part of 2020, and all of a sudden COVID happened. That was a real game changer for the long-term care community, because you can imagine they were hit very tough with COVID. And if they weren't hit specifically by it, as a lot of operators did a great job mitigating, COVID, its presence and the risks, it still created a significant lockdown. So as it related to our business and as it related to the installation business, that was a very, very significant challenge because those doors were closed. There's a real strong.
Visit anyone and.
No, it's kind of the moral code, right? The obligation that, hey, if I can't let someone's loved ones in to see them because of what's going on, I'm definitely not going to be allowing subcontractors of any level, be it, unless it was an emergency. Doors were shut. And so as we've started to emerge from that pandemic, that silver tsunami didn't go anywhere. It's just started to build up a little of that undercurl as it's getting ready to crash, you might say. And so there is a significant amount of pent-up demand that, again, as I mentioned, 3.1 million residences for a 46 plus million population and growing.
That's a huge discrepancy.
It is a significant delta. Now, granted, the pandemic, it had two sides to the coin. I think you had folks that saw it and said, hey, I've been held away from my loved ones. I don't want them in the community, and I'm going to try to bring them back and find solutions at home. At the same time, I think you saw a number of people who said, hey, my loved ones don't live close enough to me anymore for me to provide support, but I know that they can't provide support for themselves in a challenging time like a pandemic if something like this happens again. So getting into some level of long-term care is the best solution. And we've seen over the past few months, occupancy has been rising and rising very quickly in the long-term care segment of the world.
Yeah. So there's going to be, basically what you're saying is there's going to be a lot of work happening in this arena. So for a flooring contractor, for a flooring installer, it's actually a pretty exciting opportunity and something definitely worth, if you're not already in that market, definitely worth looking into. So what I guess what are some of the big differences you see between, because I know you focus on healthcare and senior living. What are some of the biggest differences you see between those two?
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. And I know you've already done a segment overview on the healthcare side, and I'm sure many of the installation partners that are watching this would recognize those buildings as facilities.
Right.
As Seth mentioned, there's going to be a significant opportunity because the senior living business just has to grow and continue to expand, whether that's through new capex, new construction, or even just the renovation as they seek and drive more occupancy and try to create enough space for this growing population. I would tell you that as you do work to pursue this type of clientele, it's really important to understand their space and know their space. And one of those big differentiators is in the long-term care aspect, these are communities and these are residents. This is taking somebody from their home potentially to the last place that they're going to carry, throughout their lifetime as they move up that acuity scale. So they're very sensitive to the fact that, again, this is their community, much like their home. They are residents. So you want to be very wary of using the word facility or patient because they carry very different connotations in the long-term care area.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's not just a change of words, it's also a change of mindset. Like when you enter this market, you have to come in knowing exactly what you said, Nick, that this is someone's home. It's not a hospital where you're there for a few hours or a day or a week. They live there, and so the things in their room are theirs, and it's it's their belongings. So we definitely have to treat that very differently. So that's a great point.
Yeah,
it really makes sense too, in the sense that, because I know we were dealing with, it wasn't a family member, but a very close friend, and hers actually, she was going, getting some Alzheimer's, so she had to go to a facility. But typically when someone reaches that state, they don't want to go there. So to tell them they're going to a facility, I mean, yeah, Nick, what you say really, and I've never really thought about it, but it does make sense, because when you've got someone about to go into one of those types of communities or residences, I'm not going to say facilities, that's really not something, they're looking forward to doing. So I think the more you can give it that, home, it makes perfect sense, Nick. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's very similar in the hospitality realm, right? They don't call people customers, they call them guests, because they want you to feel like you're welcome and they want you to come back. Very similar to when you invite somebody to your house, they're your guest, you are entertaining them, you are providing for what they need to feel welcomed. In the community aspect, it's a resident. We want you to feel like you've got an ownership stake, that this is now your group, you are a part of. And it's interesting as you look at the long-term care perspective, because there is a lot of research that's heavily tied to whether a new resident is actually welcomed and engaged within the community or not. And that research really shows that if a new resident is brought into, welcomed, and starts to get engaged within those communities and the other members, they're likely going to stay in that community. Whereas in the first 30 to 45 days, if there isn't heavy participation and community engagement, the likelihood that they're going to leave that community is very high. And so, again, community, resident, big tip of the day as you pursue and you want to get welcomed into this type of business, and you want to pursue that, because there will be much of it. It is a robust and continuously growing market. And I think, Robert, you mentioned yesterday, don't be surprised if you make a lot of friends along the way. They love visitors. They love to chat.
They do.
They love to say hello.
Yeah, one thing Nick brought up is the 55 and older communities. I live in Florida, and the largest retirement community in the world is the Villages. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, but the Villages also has facilities, or actually communities, for short-term, long-term, and for rehab and things like that. So you may have a couple that have relocated to the Villages. They've got their friends there. They've got their hobbies and things like that. And then one needs some assistance, short-term or long-term, and that way they don't have to move away. They can stay there. So it's really working out well. And I've been into several of those locations. They're massive, very well designed. They give a very homey feel for the people. So when they're there, they feel like they're in their own residence. They're in their own space. So it doesn't feel like you're in some kind of an institution or a hospital or something like that. So it's just a completely different feel.
Yeah, it was an interesting fun fact. Again, pre-COVID, the Villages was actually technically on pace, and it was always up there in the top 3 fastest growing cities in the country by people who are moving in. So it's very interesting. Again, it's technically a very large retirement and senior long care community, but by per capita and people at the move-in rate, it was challenging some of those fast growing cities like Nashville.
Yeah, the community, the Villages, their footprint just continues to expand. It's amazing how large it has actually gotten now.
Gary,
So
I
Nick,
didn't even think about it.
over healthcare and assisted living, of course we did a segment on healthcare. For instance, when I I actually get my hair cut at a community, and it's only because the young lady that cut my hair actually opened up a salon in this residence, and there again, it's this beautiful community. It's got shops, salons. I mean, they got everything they need there. But what seems to be different, obviously if you walk into a hospital and you go into the cafeteria, it's a hard surface floor. I mean, you walk into this, almost said facility. You walk into this residence, and I mean, when you walk into the cafeteria, it's a very nice patterned carpet. It's almost like walking into a ballroom. Very different feel, I think, than what you see, from a healthcare standpoint. Do you see those product categories differ substantially?
Depending on the level of acuity, sure. And I think what you want to keep in mind is that if you take a step back to the healthcare perspective, their goal is to get people in and get people out and get bills paid. That's how the revenue drives.
Right.
From a community perspective in long-term care, their goal is to get people in and keep them there and keep them happy and keep them with dignity living as long as they possibly can, because that's what keeps that revenue model going.
Right.
But outside of that, the perspective and what's needed in those products is different, to your point. And you'll find that in the healthcare arena, there is significantly more hard surface, LVT, LVP, sheet goods, heterogeneous, homogeneous. In the long-term care, again, it's more of a hospitality field. They're trying to drive back towards this is your community, this is your home, and away from the older institutional field that it used to carry, say, 20, 30 years ago. When you move up that acuity scale and you get more into the very high cognitive issues, as well as into the skilled nursing, the rehab areas, you're definitely going to find more hard surface in the corridors and definitely the resident rooms and the rehab areas. Those could be a lot of LVP, LVT, sheet goods, minimal color differentiation, minimal patterning. But to your point, when you're on those lower parts of the acuity scale, IL and an assisted, definitely in the corridors and the common spaces, you're going to find a lot of different carpet, broadloom carpet tile. You'll find LVT, LVP as well there, depending on what the use is for. One of the big differences for the long-term care is, you should be looking at and recommending installation with moisture barrier backings, no matter where you are. So if you're direct glue, direct adhesive to the floor, whether it's a hard surface, which is going to give you that moisture and permeability, or if you're using a soft good, you want to make sure that it's got that moisture barrier backing on it. So again, when it comes to the installation, Robert, you might be able to speak more to some of those intricacies and some of the challenges or perceived challenges that teams and crews and mechanics need to be prepared for, because there may not necessarily always be the same forgiveness, especially in pattern goods.
Right. No, I agree. And I think even on the standpoint, you made the comment, depending on the type of construction, whether it's new construction or whether it's a remodel. On the remodel side, yes, you gain lots of friends. They seem to, if I go back, 10, 15 years and we were doing, say, the corridors, I mean, it's like we'd be doing the corridors in the residences, which be in their residence. So they would be coming out and wanting you to have coffee and wanting to make you cookies. And you just find yourself, too, just wanting to have conversations with them. But on the new constructions and even on the old, I think you made a comment, Nick, and I loved it, the shufflers. So obviously we pay close attention to, transitions, where we might have used a track and cap. No, we don't use that simply because it creates too much of a bump. I mean, so yeah, all the AD and the slope requirement, I mean, all those, a little more attention to detail on those than say in another commercial type application.
Yeah, you're finding from a flooring, manufacturing perspective, a lot of manufacturers, specifically for the healthcare arena as well as the long-term arena, are moving to create product platforms that work with zero or minimal transition. because of, again, in the rehab side, in the health, you don't want somebody who's just had an accident or had a problem to have that transition and slip and fall. In the senior long-term care, very similarly, trip, slip, fall hazards are a big concern. But just the challenge, as you can imagine, to push a walker over a bad transition or to get your wheelchair over a bad transition could be a big thing for a senior resident. And we want to try to find solutions and work to create atmospheres that mitigate and remove as much of that as possible.
It makes perfect sense. And like Nick mentioned,
it sounds like
you get into yes.
I was just going to say, Nick, it sounds like from a top view perspective of an installer wanting to get into this market, perhaps, that's not familiar with it. You mentioned a lot of different flooring types and a lot of different variants that we may not see in other realms of commercial installations, because you're installing, like you said, patterned carpet, you're installing LVT, you're installing sheet goods, you're installing basically the whole gamut. Would you say that that's definitely something that needs to be brought to front of mind for someone looking to get into this industry, is you need installers skilled across the board?
Yeah, I would say there's a very big difference between doing the common areas, and common areas is what we consider in the long-term care anything outside of the residents. Right. And then obviously behind those doors is more like your multifamily, your hotel hospitality, or even your residential home application. Again, you're still using the commercial techniques of direct glue and adhesive and things of that nature, but having the different skill sets to work between doing common space, commercial turn, and then a resident room turn can look very, very different. And so understanding that you might have in skilled nursing crews that need to understand how to put in sheet goods with heat welding, or in an independent living, you might have some independent, to be honest, if it's that 55 and older, they might even have stretching over pad, where in the common areas, you might have some very heavy patterned hospitality goods. Again, it's probably not wildly out of control in terms of color or significant pattern due to cognitive or potential visual impairments, but from an installation perspective, very much being aware of how to do that some of those types of pattern matching can easily make or break a relationship with you and that client that is the owner of that community. And it's really about knowing the crews and the skill sets that you have, and not really over promising, and really understanding can you achieve what they're looking for, because it could really get you a big trophy, or it could get you a black eye depending on what you're ready for.
Right. Yeah.
And with some of those waterproof backs, it's not just the patterns or just the normal broadloom installation. You have to look at specific adhesives. You'll get into waterproof backs. They do require a specific high solids adhesive. And the installation is a little more temperamental than a normal installation. You have to allow the adhesive to breathe. Usually there's transfer, you pull it back out. So it is a more tedious installation, which is going to add to cost, and to make certain that those crews understand the way those products go in. They have to know what they're working with. One other thing I'd like to add, when you talk about hard surface, according to the community you're in, they may clean those common areas with hot water extraction units twice a day. So what happens, you go over an LVT or an LVP, and it makes that vinyl a little softer, a little more malleable, and you're going to get telegraphing from trowel ridges. So there's ways to eliminate that if you were normally installing homogeneous vinyl, you would normally back roll the adhesive to prevent that telegraphing. Most installers may not think about that with LVP and LVP, but it's a good step to make, because if you do that, you'll eliminate that telegraphing issue from your trowel ridges if they're doing hot water extraction, that type of thing, in those common areas.
Yeah, that's a great
point, very, very important points that are made there. Again, it's as we've talked about so far, this market is not slowing; it is growing. So for all of those out there listening, the opportunity to get and be present in the long-term care is absolutely there. And interestingly, Seth, it probably does tie back to your segment on the acute and the healthcare world, because right now you are seeing, and actually it ties to your education market too, because what's happening is there's a lot of collaboration right now between the healthcare world and the long-term care world, where you're having hospitals partner with operators, or you're having educational institutions partner with long-term care providers, because they've found, if you have, say, a senior living community on a college campus, you can provide mixed use living, and it provides potentially students the opportunity to live for free, as long as they're helping provide some of the well-being, the care, spending time with older residents, keeping their cognitive abilities up, teaching them how to use cell phones and iPads and things of that nature. And similarly with the healthcare market, you're finding a lot of the long-term care is very nice to be situated right next to hospitals, because quite frequently there might be people that, again, the hospital's revenue model is to get you in, keep you a few days, and then get you out before that law of diminishing returns starts to set in. So if they can have a partnership with a long-term community right by their campus, on their campus, if there are rehabilitation patients or patients that need a longer set of care, they can move them out from that hospital into a community, into part of their area. So again, you're seeing a lot of this connectivity as it's all working together. And it was happening, and it was happening at a relatively good pace. It was expedited very, very quickly once COVID and the pandemic set in, as they realized, things needed to work a lot more seamlessly.
Yeah. Huh.
That's good.
I wasn't even aware of that interaction. So, also you mentioned earlier, and I had never thought about it, but it's a great point of the pattern types that you'll see in these communities. Because some of those patterns, I know I've been in, airports or hotels or places where, just the pattern on the floor for me is, you look down and it's crazy, and that could definitely be an impact. So I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point.
Yeah, color and pattern play a big part in the design of these communities, and I would say a lot of them do very well at either using their own in-house design or their own outside hired firms. But depending on the scale of the operator and the operation and the number of communities they have, they may be doing a lot more on their own. So as an installer and an installation partner, by all means, if you see some of those wild patterns or any of those wild colors, you may want to just ask about what that intent is, or even from a manufacturer's perspective, if you see that for some reason you have two die lots that are running way off from each other, and it's going to create a different colored band on the floor, that should be something that you want to address ahead of time, so it doesn't fall necessarily on the installation partner's shoulders, but it also doesn't create a larger issue within the community and creates a really big liability issue, which could be bad.
Yeah.
So Nick, do you see, being of course in your position, do you see most of the business going to, just, because I know in the town that I'm in Rockwall, Texas, there has been communities, keep wanting to say facilities, there has been these residences, they're just going up everywhere. I mean, they really are. And so do you see more of this business going with, just large nationwide providers that are building these facilities, or is it just, retailers, dealers, just kind of all over the country taking up most of this?
Honestly, it's both and so depending on the scale of the operation that, and when we say operation or operator, that would be like, your big name players that have, tens of hundreds of communities around the country. They may lean towards a larger singular, provider for either, common space work or rooms turns work, because they can service so many locations in so many places. But then as you move outside of that and you get to the operators that may have 5 communities, 10 communities, maybe even 15 communities, or even just 2 communities, they're absolutely looking to the relationships in their local markets. They're looking for their local dealer and installation partners that they can trust, that they know that they've got relationships with manufacturers that can get the products that they'd like to use. They know that they've got the crews with the skill sets that can accomplish the different needs of that community. Because again, if you're just going into a standard independent living community, you probably, the same type of crew could probably handle most of the products that might go in there. If you're going into what they call a CCRC, which is a continuing care retirement community, it covers the whole spectrum. And you might have everything from independent all the way up to skilled and memory. Then they're going to look for that partner who we mentioned earlier has got all of those crews with all of those skill sets, because that large community is going to require a varying degree of different products in different locations. And they're going to want to find somebody that they feel comfortable and confident, can do a lot of that. And again, maybe that local group only gets one half of the work and another group gets the other half of the work because that's what's worked out best, or that's where the skill sets lie. But again, as the business grows, you mentioned in Rockwell, Robert, they're popping up all over the place. And if they're not popping up under new construction, I promise you within your marketplace, your towns, your cities, there are renovations that are happening right now as the consolidation and the acquisitions are definitely happening in this space.
Yeah,
Well,
Nick,
it
I was
sounds
just
like
gonna
all
ask
of us
you about that.
just need to get into the business
So-
of building. I mean, if you're, we're listening to the numbers in the beginning of, you've got about, just over 3 million beds and you've got 46 million people to put in them. It's what is that, 15%, as far as, supply versus demand, and you're saying another 18 to 20 million over the next 5 years. Boy, I think we need a joint venture on building communities.
Sure. I mean, if you
Wow,
look at the scarier numbers
business
and
opportunity.
after 2030, they're projecting that the over 65 population will be greater than the under 18 population.
Wow.
And it will actually
Wow.
be, a vast majority just based on that baby boomer generation really pushing through. So, the need and the demand will be there. They're projecting anywhere from 80 to 90 million residents over 65 at that point. More than
Wow.
one at 2030, 1 in 5 of our population will be there and ready.
It's an eye-opening
That's a
figure.
huge number. So Nick,
So I think if I had a work
Hey,
room,
Robert.
a dealer, contractor, I mean, I think I would definitely be finding a guy that had some of Nick's skill sets, and that would, because I know contractors that, they've got a guy that does schools, they've got a guy that does different segments. I mean, it's sounding like they'd be foolish not to have some guy that just literally, or guy or gal that focused just on this particular category, looking at the void.
So you asked me to be on the bright side, so I won't call anybody foolish, but I'd say they would be smart if they did.
There you go. There you go. Much better.
Yeah.
Much better.
So Robert, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Seth. Go ahead.
I'm just joking. I'm going to blame your internet out there. Nick, I was going to ask
I
you.
couldn't
You
hear you.
mentioned. I know. I got it. I was going to bring it back. You mentioned acquisitions, and just kind of breezed over that. But what have you seen? I know through COVID, a lot of these lockdowns. You mentioned the transitions people are making, the decisions of, do I bring my loved one back home, or do I, put them in one of these communities? How did that impact these smaller operators and these different businesses all throughout the country? Are you seeing a lot more acquisition activity? What's going on in that realm?
Yeah, I mean, to be real honest, from where I sat, I thought the operators within the U.S. did an amazing job working through and handling the pandemic in every which way they possibly could. And that's a generalization, because I can't speak for every single operator in every single community, but I think by and large they probably had an unfair picture painted of that part of the industry by the media and what was happening. And I don't want to take away from the fact that obviously that age demographic and that population was hit incredibly hard by COVID, just the impacts of what it did. Now, what that created was you had a lot of operators that weathered that storm very well, but you also had operators that, again, just due to cost of acquiring PPE and new protocols and things of that nature, I think that you have other operators that were able to manage better. So you had some that probably are not going to and did not survive the storm very well. And that has created that consolidation under new management and new ownership. And so as that happens, generally those groups, they move into brand standards similar to like a hotel or designs, changes, operational and aesthetic. That again is going to create some of this turn and some of this continued boom with what's going on. But by and large, the industry is very strong. And again, it's continuing to grow. As we mentioned, the supply is not exceeding the demand, like Mark mentioned in the supply chain, challenges. So that the supply is definitely robust there, and it's going to continue. And occupancy, as I mentioned earlier, it's continuing to climb. So
right. So guys, we have just a couple of minutes left here. I definitely want to hit on a couple of things as well, and then I want to just ask you kind of that bottom line in a moment here. So be thinking about what's kind of that 30 to 60 second thing that you could tell anyone viewing that's really important. But before we jump there, Nick, I just want to ask you, what are you seeing as far as pricing? So as we heard from Mark in the first segment of this show on supply chain, obviously prices are going crazy. Everything from lumber to anything petrochemical based, shipping, transportation, all of it has risen. I mean, not somewhat, like dramatically. Are you seeing any of that cost being passed on to the residents in these communities? Are you seeing that cost of living going up to them? What do you see happening with that in the near future?
By and large, I haven't seen significant cost increases in cost of living being passed on. I'm not an expert there, from the operator's side to know, again, market by market, have they? But in all of the reading and the research I have, again, I haven't seen by and large that really happening yet. But they weren't, the doors were shut, right, for the last year, and they're just coming out of it now. So I guess some of those unanticipated increases in costs as they go through renovations and new constructions over the course of probably the next 6 to 12 months, might reverberate out that direction. More so, right. What you are seeing is a lot of folks are just kind of tiering their type communities. So again, very similar like the hotel hospitality model of having different brands within an ownership, and then letting that guest from a hospitality standpoint, or in this case, a resident, choose what level of financial commitment can I make, what amenities am I looking for, what level of care is required. That really is a lot of the price break thresholds and differentiators that you see market by market.
Yep.
And then obviously what type of financial assistance they're getting from the government. And that could be both is the owner operator getting financial assistance out of some of these large financial stimulus packages that have recently been passed by the Biden administration, or are the residents themselves seeing higher inputs from Medicare and Medicaid and some of the lobbying that's happening right now, again, for assistance on their behalf up on Capitol Hill. So those all have impacts as to what those rent costs are.
Yeah. So a lot to be seen for sure. Gary, let's jump to you for the bottom line. If I'm a contractor or a flooring installer looking to get into this market, tell me what your number one thing would be that you would want to give me as advice.
Before you get started, you want to know what the regulations are with state and local for maintenance and things like that. Find out if there's any additional stresses that will be put on the floor covering you're installing, and you need to take precautions based on that. Also, you need to know what type of floor covering you're installing or working with to see if there are any additional costs that are going to be involved as far as labor, like Nick was mentioning, waterproof backs and things like that. You have to know everything, do your homework ahead of time, because if you don't, it's going to cost you big time in the end. In many cases, these type of facilities will actually give you a deadline for completion, and if you pass that up, you're going to be paying liquidated damages, which could be pretty substantial.
Okay, gotcha. Robert, your turn. Here comes the hot seat. What's the bottom line from you? What would you say is one of the biggest things, pieces of advice you could offer someone watching today?
Well, I think, obviously the void, meaning the supply and the demand, we've ran through those numbers a few times. Kind of makes sense as to now why I see that costing so much to the actual residents. Obviously, with such a small supply and such a huge demand. As far as with me too, and I think we've touched on it in a lot of our segments, it's about the relationships. So first, I think I would, if I was wanting to get into this, which after listening to the numbers, I mean, I would think you would want to. I think you should then look around and say, okay, who do I need to develop those relationships with in order to get into this segment of the business? I would also, as I mentioned earlier, see if there was someone I could see, whether it's within my staff from a sales standpoint that might have some information on it, but someone that I could pick that could basically then take on and pursue this segment of the business. Because obviously it's big enough to, in my opinion, to accommodate hiring on someone to just focus on that piece of the business.
Yeah, absolutely, especially from the numbers we've talked about today. So Nick, I'm going to ask you to bring it home for us. You've shared a ton of great information today, but if you had to boil it down, give me 30 to 60 seconds on kind of your elevator pitch on why someone should be interested in this market or what they should do to reach into it.
Yeah, so as we've mentioned, the market's robust. The opportunity is there to break into this. I think the big thing you want to remember is it's about dignity. It's about dignity of the residents. You're walking into their home. The people that work there, the owners, the operators, the care staff, they are dedicated to the care and the well-being of these residents and making sure that they feel like they're home. So every time you go and you engage with those folks or you step onto a job site, just think of it as if it was walking into your mom or your dad's house, your brother, your sisters. It's the place where they're living. So with that in mind, again, I think that's what will help you build those relationships, as Robert mentioned, because it is a relationship business. And again, in this particular segment, it is all about feeling like you're part of the family and making them feel like they're part of your family.
Yep. That is great advice. Definitely could not have said it better. So I'm going to leave it there. Gary, Robert, Nick, thank you guys so much for joining us today. I think Mark is still on, which is incredible. I hope you learned something, Mark. So thank you for joining us as well for the supply chain tech segment. You guys encourage people to come and watch this. Obviously, it's still linked on our